All right, guys. I hope you're doing well. Sorry for I don't think I've ever done one of these live streams to where it was actually sunny outside, so I never knew that window could get so bright. So sorry if that annoys you. I'll, yeah, I'll try to kind of get in the way of it, but see if that makes it any better. I don't know if I'll completely block it out or not. Anyways, I want to go over my most recent post about macroeconomics and why it is important. Macro is something that I've been very interested in for quite some time, and I like to study the nuances and stuff that go really deep down rabbit holes. I just think it's fascinating, like getting into literally bare bones how the banking system works. What technically is a deposit? Who technically owns it? Because fun fact, you don't actually own your bank deposit, but that's a separate topic in a whole nother post. It's really cool actually, but that's the stuff I like to nerd out about. But I realize that since this is something that I nerd out about a lot of people don't understand like the basics and stuff. And kind of a disclaimer, it's like I've never actually taken a macroeconomics class. All of this stuff is from talking to people who are much smarter than me in the space and everything else. I go to conferences and I talk to people who do this for a living, and that's basically how I learned is a bunch of podcasts, my own reading, um, actually going and I bet like not reading it in a book, but actually looking at like the Federal Reserve websites and stuff like that. That's how I learned. But anyways, more particular to the post. So macroeconomics is basically it's very large scale, right? Um, and the problem with it and why understanding macroeconomics is important is because if you don't, you leave yourself open to a lot of trouble. There's a couple sayings, one of which is it's like you don't know what you don't know, and that's a huge problem. Is because you have to know what you don't know, and a lot of people don't. And it's one of those things, if you have a major macroeconomic factor come in that wants to wipe out an industry, 2008, and the GFC, right? Yeah, the GFC, Great Financial Crisis of 2008 to whenever they decided it ended. Um, and a lot of people hear about this in real estate, or at least for me, because that's what I'm really into. But you hear a lot of people made a lot of money in the early 2000s just to lose almost all of it, if not all of it, in 2008 to around 2013, right? Why was that? It's because they didn't know about these macroeconomic factors that really drove that recession. Um, because the whole, you're told in school, or at least I was told in school, that the GFC happened because of like subprime lending and stuff like that. Not really. There was a bunch of other stuff that goes into that, and there are entire books written about that, so I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. But trying to stay on topic, before we can extrapolate to macro, we need to understand what economics is to begin with. And it's really just a social science and it analyzes the most efficient way to utilize scarce resources, right? Because everyone understands that we have things. I have this mouse right here, is my phone, pens, stuff like that. Like there's so much, even just like pens and stuff, I can't take one apart. um, but like even just this pen, if I can take this. Never mind. You understand what I'm doing. You got the ink, there's the plastic, the button, there's a spring right in the middle. There's a lot of parts that go into it, and you have to get that stuff together. Well, there's only a finite amount of resources on the planet, right? At least at a given time. And in here I gave the example of oil, right? Because people say that it's a non-renewable resource. It's not that there won't be more oil on the planet. It's that we are using it faster than the earth can replenish it, because that oil is made from like things dying, decaying, seeping into the ground and under immense pressure and everything else. It creates oil over thousands of years. Um, so I mean, that process is still going on, right? It's just that we're using it much quicker than the Earth can produce it, and so we consider it non-renewable, right? Um, and there's only a certain amount at a specific time and period. That's what we mean. Therefore, it's scarce, right? We have a fixed amount, but we have an unlimited want for it, right? Because I mean, we got cars, we have airplanes, we make plastics out of it, which plastic is pretty much one of the most fundamental substances on the earth at this point. It's all made from oil or one of its derivatives, right? So we have an unlimited stuff that we want to use for it. Um, but we only have so much. And economics is basically the science on how we deal with that, right? I mean, we could just as easily basically use all the oil on the planet to make only pens. But I mean, that's a lot of pens, but it doesn't really help anything, right? Just because we can write, I mean, how are we going to run the machines to cut down the trees so that we and the make and run the machines to make paper so the pens are useless? Economics is kind of the way to determine how to use that, right? How to use those resources, in this case, oil, to produce the maximum amount of let me rephrase that. To create the optimal amount of very specific things, right? On of goods and services to do certain things, right? Um, so people get into the nuance. I won't hear because that's not the point, but socialism, capitalism, and everything in between, or whatever you want to think, is they're all economic systems, right? Just to give examples. And it's all of these systems. The entire point is to use those scarce resources like we talked about and produce goods and services to be consumed by the population, right? That is the only reason. Now they differ in how they allocate those resources. For example, is it like a market, like with capitalism, where it's more or less free market, which is arguable, um, at least of what we have right now. Um, but there's some form of market that dictates how resources are allocated, or where you have in socialism, where it's centrally planned, where it's the government that states what we're going to use certain things for. They can also they can also differ in the means of production and who owns it, right? Is it private or public ownership, right? And you can have any variation of those. Those are all just examples of systems that they're all meant to do the same thing. They're just different ways to do the same thing. They are all different ways to take scarce resources and produce goods and services for from them, right? So all macroeconomics is just extrapolating this to a large scale. So instead of talking about like two businesses within a town or a consumer and a producer or whatever, you're talking on the scale of entire countries, um, either between each other or within one, right? Large scale. Macro is big. That's the point. And one of the things that I found was a good that they use this for is called the circular flow model. It's literally a circle. Now you can have anywhere from two to I've seen five sectors from this, right? And each one it gets more and more complicated, but it's more and more accurate, right? Here's the two sector model where you have households and then you have firms, right? So like your businesses, whatever. Your households through consumer expenditure, you paying for stuff, the households pay the businesses, right? And in return, the businesses give goods and services to households. Also, I'm not 100% sure if you can see my mouse on this, so I don't know. I'm sure someone will comment eventually on if you can see my mouse. If so, please do, because I have no idea. Um, I haven't thought about it using StreamYard before. But anyways, and then also the firms transact with households through like wages, rent, dividend, depending on the relationship. So, like, if you're an employee, you get wages from the business. If you're a shareholder, you get dividends from the business, hopefully, at least. And that labor and stuff that as an employee, in return for the wages, you're giving them your labor, right? That's what this factors of production means. Now, it can be other things too, but that's as one example. Here is, dang, oh, trying to make it to where you can see the whole thing at once. It'll be fine. This is the five sector model, right? So you have households. Here's the firms again. You have government, okay? And then you have the overseas sector. So this is your foreign countries and foreign trade. And then you have financial markets, right? And then it's the same idea where you have here's a market all in the middle here for goods and services, and here's the factors of production, right? And so this is a lot more accurate because you can see where, like households, you have private savings going into financial markets. So, like having savings in banks, investing in the stock market, buying bonds, stuff like that. You have your taxes flowing into the government. Government also gets into financial assets and stuff. Um, Financial markets pay for public deficits through buying bonds and stuff from the government and other things. Government expenditures, it's all in here, right? You can do loans, you can do that's part of that. The problem with this is this can be misleading because even though it looks it's definitely more complicated than the two sector model. It's not exactly. I mean, it's not too bad, right? It's not that bad, really. Overseas, you get imports, exports. That's the only thing going in and out, stuff like that. Problem is, what this doesn't go over is stuff like the repo market between banks, which is basically, and this is what provides liquidity for the entire global financial system, right? So basically, um, a lot of the times you have it dealing with between commercial banks in the United States, where it's repossession. Same idea as you getting like your truck repoed or whatever, where you don't pay and they take it. Sort of, not really the same thing. It's like getting a dollar loan, and then you have to pledge some form of collateral. Um, Maybe it's like T-bills or whatever, and then in return you get that loan as an interest rate. Um, and there's a lot of stuff to go into that. And if you want to go down some rabbit holes, one of the people that I listen to and study is George Gammon. He goes over the repo market quite some to a decent extent. Um, he's the person who I even found out about it, to be honest, because this wasn't in anything I've seen before until he started talking about it in his whiteboard videos. And he's on YouTube too, at just George Gammon channel or whatever. There's also like the Eurodollar system where you have foreign banks giving dollar denominated loans and a bunch of other stuff. To be honest, I'm a lot less familiar with the Eurodollar system. That's not something I've studied too in depth. I'm more familiar with the repo market. But if you want more on the Eurodollar system, go to Jeff Snyder and Emil Kalinowski. They have a Eurodollar University. I think it's on YouTube, but I know it's on Spotify because that's where I listen to it. Um, but this isn't the point of this post. This is just to show that there are way more factors that go into this, and there are a lot of cross currents and things that go on that really makes this interesting and much more complex than people think, right? But and then you basically just had to go into like, okay, how do we measure it? Because you hear a lot of people talk about making the analogy between the economy and a car, right? Which is surprisingly a pretty good analogy. You have the engine, which like creates the power and stuff, and that you can see through trade, whether it be between states, between businesses, between countries, it doesn't matter. Then you have like transmission, which is transmitting the power to the ground from the engine, right? So you have like interest rates, excuse me, business loans, stuff like that, where you actually get like investments sort of stuff to grow businesses and sectors and industries and actually produce things and so on, right? And this is where you'll see some of the stuff of like how do you measure it? You have like you hear talk of GDP, the gross domestic product. It's just basically the dollar value of all the final goods and services produced within a country within a year, right? You have stuff like unemployment. There's different types of unemployment. And so, like, how much of which type is important to know. There's inflation, deflation, and even that goes into different things. There's different things that could cause it. You could have you could have inflation or deflation in asset prices or consumer prices or producer prices. And this is where you see stuff like the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. This is where you hear those kind of numbers flow around. You got the money supply, a lot of and monetary policy, all involving the banking system. So you got like Fed funds rate, M1, M2. You deal with fiscal policy, it's government spending, supply and demand, just commercial banking systems, foreign trade. You have forex markets where you're trading different currencies. There's a lot of different things that you can use to measure it, and they all have their place and certain things. And it's really interesting listening to different people because this is macroeconomics is a topic to where you really need to get very diverse information from different people, right? Because they are, depending on the perspective, you can see almost two different things sometimes. Um, it's definitely interesting to watch, right? But really, why this is important, macroeconomics in general, is because you hear the phrase like a rising tide lifts all boats, and this I've heard this most about the like the stock market and stuff. They're saying it's like when you have a bunch of liquidity going thrown into the stock market and everything else and starts to rise, basically everything goes with it, right? Um, you hear that with bull markets. Well, macro is kind of what dictates those tides, right? So that tide that brings the whole market up is going to be like a lot of the times it's demographics or policy or what that all kind of goes into macro. At least now it does, because now whenever you want to answer some kind of question about macroeconomics, you have to take political policies into account now. From my understanding, it hasn't always been that way, or it was a significant to or it was to a significantly less degree. But especially the past couple years of it being 2022, and at this point, everyone knows what happened in 2020 and so on. Um, I don't know how much I can actually say because of at the current moment of all the censorship and such. But hopefully, you get what I mean. Um, but anyways, so yeah, it's really important to have a basic understanding of macroeconomic factors and how they interact with different things within the economy, right? Because if you're ignorant about it, it could completely wipe out everything you've worked for, right? That's not just investments, that's savings too. History actually has quite a few examples of literally just holding cash in your hand, how that can be detrimental, right, to your finances, right? Now, I don't want to say there's few examples of that. I'll say there are few examples of that relative to all of history, I guess. To where it seems like most of the time that is not a bad idea, um, especially if you don't know what you're doing. But just know that even holding cash in a safe is not risk free, right? All the time. And then you can define risk by whatever you want. Um, I've heard a lot of people talk about how it's like they say risk and they think of like, like interest rates on like the nominal value of their asset or whatever. Or you can think about, okay, what about real prices and stuff like that? Because that's where this stuff gets involved, where you have like here's GDP or nominal GDP, and then you have real GDP, and then you have GDP deflators, and there's a bunch of other stuff too. That's just the point of this post was to kind of just be an introduction to this is what macro is, this is why it's important to learn. And then I plan on doing further posts on maybe specific factors like as people ask questions and get more in depth and everything else. I have done a few posts previously on like the Like this one is a lot of it's about the National Banking Act of 1863, which is really kind of almost the founding of our more modern banking system and a little more of the history behind it. Because the Federal Reserve wasn't chartered until 1913, which, and the second link is where I talk about how the Federal Reserve System works and stuff like that. Um, so yeah, that's pretty much it. Feel free to leave a comment. I love if you think I missed anything that you think is important to like kind of a basic overview of not the topic of macro, but kind of what it is and why it's important, which is the point of this post. I'm not going to go into the differences between real and nominal GDP or cyclical and structural unemployment and stuff like that. That's not the point of this specific post. But yeah, please feel free to leave a comment or anything. I love having discussions about this stuff. It makes it a lot more entertaining instead of just so I don't feel like I'm talking to myself. But anyways, I'll see you guys in the next video, and I hope you guys have a good day.